Forspoken's launch on PlayStation 5 has been a bit rocky, with the game proving to have uneven visuals and inconsistent performance, and I've been wondering this entire time if the PC version is the panacea to all the woes John touched on in his incredibly in-depth video on that PlayStation 5 version. So, does the PC version improve on issues seen on PlayStation 5? What are optimized settings if there are any? And lastly, how does Forspoken utilize the DirectStorage API in its debut outing? To cut to the chase, right up till launch, I was very nervous about Forspoken on PC. For one, Square Enix as a publisher does not have a great track record of great PC versions, and previous games released on PC from Square Enix like Final Fantasy VII Intergrade are genuinely very poor releases. But immediately on getting in the game menu, I was taken aback. Prima facie, this has all the hallmarks of a good PC version. We have a settings menu with the core image quality, reconstruction techniques, dynamic resolution, variable rate shading, added in ray traced ambient occlusion apparently, and even an in-game benchmark. But those are just the options. How successfully implemented are these PC niceties? First, let's start with image quality options. We have access here to DLSS 2.4.12, FSR 2.1, and even XeSS if you plug in an ARC GPU. On average, I would say all work fine enough, but they all have issues in their own right. On the FSR 2.1 side of things, the image resolve leaves a bit to be desired in three aspects. The first is any transparency effects, such as particles. Like here in this scene, where you can notice all the fire is ghosted out of whack, so to speak, in the FSR 2.1 presentation. Doesn't look like it's being properly accounted for in the reconstruction, unlike in DLSS or XeSS. This happens with all particle effects in the game. The second aspect, which does not hold up well in FSR 2.1, is general movement and disocclusion. Set a character off on a jog and you just look at them in their movement, and it's pretty easy to notice the disocclusion fizzle around the character and the general blockiness of the reconstructed pixels on the character. That does not happen with XeSS or DLSS. Same with the camera rotations and the disocclusion from that, which makes the background near the character look distorted with a trail of fizzle, and the character itself is a bit pixelated in comparison to DLSS or XeSS. The last aspect where FSR2 is a bit less than spectacular is depth of field, but here XeSS is actually quite a bit worse. If you put it next to DLSS, you can see post-process blurs in this game have a pixelated look to them with FSR, as if they're not being reconstructed properly. Like I mentioned though, FSR is dramatically better than XeSS for depth of field in this game, where in a three-way like you're seeing here, you can see XeSS has massive flickering issues with depth of field. Any single time depth of field is on screen, it flickers incessantly. It's honestly incredibly distracting, and it's almost as if the XeSS implementation here is not finished. Overall, I would say DLSS offers the best image quality in the game, albeit it has troubles of its own. Both DLSS and XeSS show noticeable issues with single pixel specular effects when motion blur is on, like here on this wall as the main character runs by. Notice how the light reflected off the wall here lights up individual pixels which sparkle and are dragged out into lines by the motion blur. It's almost as if a firefly filter is not active with DLSS on. This does not happen for all specular reflections, but when it does, like we see on the ground here, and you have motion blur on, FSR 2.1 will provide a much superior image in such scenario without this sparkling issue. As I mentioned though, the intensity of the sparkling only happens while motion blur is on. If you do not have it on, the issue is much lessened, but it's still honestly not perfect. So all in all, every image reconstruction option in this game is less than perfect, and even the game's own TAA and native resolution has issues. It goes on particles much like FSR 2.1 does. But even with all these issues, the image quality on PC is still at least noticeably better than on PlayStation 5, primarily due to DLSS being better than FSR 2.1 in this game most of the time, and the internal resolution being much higher on PC.
Shit. Oh, no.
So how about those other PC niceties in the options here? Dynamic resolution. While this did not work for me correctly in the launch version of the game, the patched version as of the 31st of January does have dynamic resolution function in a similar way to PlayStation 5. With this feature, you can use your image reconstruction of choice and turn on dynamic resolution. For example, here in this scene, I have DLSS quality mode engaged at 4K on the RTX 4090 hitting 98 FPS, and turning on dynamic resolution brings the FPS to just under 120 while keeping image quality high as DLSS is still engaged in upscaling up to 4K. The problem is here is it causes more problems than it alleviates. Do not use dynamic resolution in this game, as turning it on for some reason absolutely destroys frame times. Watch me turn it on here on a PC equipped with an RTX 3080 and Ryzen 5 3600. Watch the frame times as I go back into game after turning it on. It's so awful, and the game becomes unplayable when you turn on dynamic resolution. So for the moment, in spite of it lowering resolution correctly, I recommend leaving it off as it induces massive stutter. Sadly, variable rate shading is also not working, but in a different way. It mentions aiding performance with little image quality reduction, but honestly, I've tested a lot of locations with or without particle effects, and I'm not seeing a performance difference from having it on, let alone a visual difference. According to the game's presentations, it should be a VRS Tier 1 implementation, I believe, which is technically the worst type of VRS, but I can't really find an instance of it being visible in performance or image quality. So maybe it's not working on my end, and that brings me to the game's two ray tracing options, shadows and ambient occlusion. To be completely honest with you, these have to be some of the most lackluster ray tracing options I've ever seen in a large title release to date. The ray trace shadows, for example, don't apply to many objects. All larger foliage is done with shadow maps, which have a lot of aliasing and motion. All grass is done with barely visible screen space shadows, which tend to dither into nothingness. Character hair is done with shadow maps as well, and even the number of scenes I've seen full characters in their own right having entire shadows done with shadow maps, like we can see here in this cutscene with the city guard's shadow. Really obvious shadow map issues there. When turning on RT shadows, you're basically getting the extremely bare minimum RT shadow implementation. It helps out for smaller opaque details like those close to the camera, and can definitely add in some nice softening for distance shadows, but so many objects do not see their benefit. Turning them on a high-end GPU like the RTX 4090 had a significant 20% or more performance cost. But the cost in VRAM of that BVH structure for the ray tracing on the GPU is significant to make this option a no-go for anyone with a mid-range GPU. RT ambient occlusion somehow manages to be even worse than this though. For one, it almost looks like it's not working in gameplay. Take this scene here. Notice the lack of a difference when RTAO is on. It looks pretty much exactly like the screen space ambient occlusion technique. In fact, it functions like screen space AO. Check out the scene here where the main character is sneaking alongside these barrels. Notice how the ambient occlusion around their legs there, near the barrels, keeps disappearing as she's occluding it. These are typical screen space issues. RTAO should rather look like this, as we're seeing in Battlefield 2042. On the left, we can see screen space AO with typical outline shader look to it, where only the tires are getting darkening. With RTAO on the right, with its longer ray length, as seen in Battlefield 2042, we can see the appearance of ambient shadowing from the skylight above. The entire undercarriage of this digger here has a shadow, and the undersides of all the geometry are realistically darkened as well. This is how RTAO should look when it's implemented correctly. In gameplay in Forspoken, it almost looks like it's not working, or perhaps has such a short ray length that it looks basically exactly like SSAO. But I have noticed that sometimes working more correctly in random cutscenes. For example, this one where the main character is looking at these shoes. With RTAO on, we can see it applying more correctly for just this cutscene in this moment, adding more convincing ambient shadowing underneath the shelves there. But as soon as the cutscene ends, yep, the RTAO looks to be completely off. Where did it go? Why was it only on in this one cutscene? And it only seems to happen in very few cutscenes. Most of the cutscenes I've seen in the game don't even have it on at all. It looks basically like SSAO there. I only realized this was happening due to a visual error I saw on the PlayStation 5 version. When this cutscene starts on PlayStation 5, you can actually see the RTAO fade in. So yeah, the PlayStation 5 version actually has RTAO in the same manner as the PC version. It just turns on randomly in cutscenes at times. As a result of this behavior, RTAO is just a bad option in this game. If you turned it on in gameplay scenes, it looks nearly the exact same, but you will see a performance hit of near 10% I measured on an RTX 4090, but most egregiously it will have a large effect on VRAM due to the BVH structure being built, 500 megabytes there, which is definitely not worth it on any mid-range GPU. Truly, those of you looking for anything near optimized settings in this game on almost any GPU, even bigger ones, ought to just consider turning RTAO off, and even RT shadows off, as they're not very qualitatively good. So as you can see, a lot of the game's options are not working correctly. In fact, I encountered a number of bugs while playing the game as well on PlayStation 5 and PC. On PS5, when playing the intro, a number of LODs, for example, one time never even loaded. Just look at how deformed this car is. On PC, I found even more bugs. Check out how this opening cutscene in the game once never loaded the building in the court scene, so everyone was just kind of floating in the ether. I saw this type of behavior as well as a number of missing objects or lights at times in PC cutscenes, and I recorded at least 4 different crashes in my short time playing the game, making me think that this PC release has a number of issues just beyond the graphical options and settings. The whole experience feels held together with glue to a degree at times, and it even translates over to simple things like the game camera. Really often while playing the game, I had the feeling that I was seeing frame drops right in front of me, but I would go over my footage after the fact and there was none to be found. In fact, the game doesn't really seem to have stutters. I didn't find any of the shader compilation variety here, but the gameplay camera tends to add stutter into the game in its own right, like we're seeing here in this scene, where there's a perfect 60 FPS, but notice how the camera motion makes it look like the frame rate is dropping. So there are a number of issues, but at least the execution of game loading and direct storage here is one of the few bright spots in an otherwise kind of poor release. Placed next to the PlayStation 5 loading the exact same save from the same area and timing the moment I hit the button, we can see that a 3.5 GB per second NVMe with a 12900K indeed loads the game faster under direct storage on Windows 11 than PlayStation 5. With direct storage forced off with a command line option, we can see that the same load on that 3.5 GB per second NVMe with a 12900K takes around 25% longer and is slower than the PlayStation 5 without direct storage. With a Ryzen 5 3600, we can see that that same NVMe speed is not enough to overtake the PlayStation 5, being a number of seconds slower and almost 3 times slower without direct storage on. So direct storage will help, but CPU speed is also an important factor. The slower your CPU is, the more direct storage helps. Another factor is drive speed. When checking out the loads that we can see on a SATA SSD, we can see that it loads the game nearly twice as slowly as a 3.5 GB per second NVMe drive. So the CPU is not going to be the only factor in loading speed, and it's a holistic thing. Another test I did was checking out the difference between Windows 11 and 10, and as Microsoft has maintained, direct storage does indeed seem to noticeably help Windows 11 more than 10, with direct storage on Windows 11 loading consistently 2 seconds faster in my tests, with direct storage off running nearly the same between both operating systems. All in all, this is a neat debut for direct storage, but I don't think it's a real game changer here. It's just that Forspoken is a game with very optimized loading in general. Direct storage's most important feature, GPU decompression, does not appear to be used in Forspoken in my testing. I can't find evidence of GPU decompression in action when checking out the GPU compute usage, for example, when the game is doing a dedicated load. Also, the numbers I'm finding line up with those found in Luminous's presentation on their direct storage implementation, which they describe as not using GPU decompression. In gameplay itself, direct storage and loading doesn't seem that intense. Streaming tends to be kept within reasonable SSD safe levels usually, with a max streaming amount I've seen of around 300 megabytes per second when traversing the game world quickly and swinging the camera about wildly. I think those are very reasonable numbers, but still not everything is perfect in this game's loading, as I think I have found a bug with its streaming. After loading up a save, I can consistently measure that the game makes 500 megabytes per second transfers ambiently every second for minutes on end, even while the camera is perfectly still. In one moment, I captured it transferring 90 gigabytes of data over a period of 3 minutes while the camera was perfectly still the entire time, until this behavior just kind of stopped for no apparent reason. I'm not sure why this streaming is happening in the background for minutes on end, even though nothing's changing. So the game may still have some bugs in its current implementation. Another thing that I noticed that was curious is that when I would force direct storage off on Windows 10 and 11, there would be an intense effect on CPU related performance. When purely GPU limited, like we're seeing here on the RTX 4090, direct storage being on or off has zero effect on the GPU's performance. But when CPU limited, like we're seeing here on that same machine with a much lower internal resolution to make the game CPU limited, we can see that direct storage being off has a huge effect on frame times and the overall frame rate. But if you look at that frame time graph and CPU utilization, this lower performance doesn't look correct and it looks weirdly artificial. So this is the grain of salt that comes with my testing here. The ability to force DirectStorage off with the command line parameter that I'm using here in this testing is not actually supposed to be exposed to users, and it is actually hidden away. So it may not be working 100% correctly. So keep that in mind with all this testing I've just shown. Based on everything we've seen so far, there are a lot of issues in Forspoken on PC, and this unfortunately carries over to general performance and optimized settings. Optimized settings in this game require some really large air quotes because the game by default is very heavy for very poor visual return in comparison to its peers. Check out the shot of Cyberpunk with ray tracing set to ultra next to Forspoken maxed out. Both are at 1440p DLSS performance mode, and Cyberpunk runs nearly the same as Forspoken, even though it is doing a lot more and looks a lot better. Another issue is that just moving the camera has a huge impact on GPU performance. Check this out, when I stare in any of the cardinal directions in Forspoken in this one scene, like north, south, east, and west, we can see how the performance on an ARC A770, for example, is always above 40. Each view when standing in the same position 90 degrees apart is between 42 and 46 FPS. So you would imagine that when I move the camera, the frame rate would oscillate gradually between these values. Well, you would be wrong. Just moving the camera in this game causes a near 20% drop in performance. With the camera moving, every view here is below 40 FPS. This is all without motion blur, by the way. And the nail in the coffin for optimized settings in this game is that the texture streamer is very poor. Once again, the in-game settings here are of little help. By looking at the description text for the texture setting, I imagine many would have a hard time knowing how this setting plays with their GPU video memory. To actually know how it interacts with your memory, you have to read a Steam post from a developer on the issue, where it is described that the high settings were developed for GPUs with 12 gigabytes of memory. That is a sure interesting choice given the extreme wealth of 8 gigabyte GPUs on the market. So what about 8 gigabyte GPUs? Well, this is where the problem lies. With textures set to standard as recommended by the developer in that Steam post, what happens is shocking. The textures in the game on an 8 gigabyte GPU on standard, or any setting actually, never actually load to look good. They just generally always look like something straight out of a game from the late 90s. Even when trying at 1080p in DLSS performance mode, which is internally 540p, just to clear space on the GPU for those textures to load, they never do. I'm doing this without ray tracing, by the way, so it's not competing for resources. The game on 8GB GPUs, regardless of settings or texture settings, is just going to look awful. I cannot recommend optimized settings here. There's almost no point. It's tough for me to say this, but I cannot at all recommend anyone with an 8GB GPU purchase or play this game. If your GPU has more VRAM, such as a RTX 3080, as you can see here, the game will load textures in a more normal way, and the game becomes more recommendable at that point. For those of you that do want to take a dip, I have some recommendations for settings. If you're on a Ryzen 3000 or older Intel platform, make sure to not use ray tracing, as you're going to not get a consistent 60 FPS in the game's cities due to ray tracing's burden on the CPU. And based upon ray tracing's poor visual quality win here, it honestly makes sense for many users to just turn it off. Secondly, for nice and easy GPU wins, drop down cloud quality to low. You will scarcely see a difference, and it can offer up a nice 10% or more performance increase when a lot of sky is on screen. A third optional recommendation for those of you looking for more GPU performance is turn down screen space reflections to standard. There's a small win, but it can introduce a bit of instability there in the reflections. But other than that, I have no other optimized settings for you as is. Honestly, the game is already not too great looking in my opinion, and sacrificing things like shadow quality or model quality is ill-advised. And that is really all I have to say about this game on PC. It misses a lot of opportunities in its launch version. Due to how ray tracing is done here, where RTAO barely affects the image, the PC version of this game mainly looks better than the console version in areas of image quality, anisotropic filtering, and performance. But that only applies to high-end users. Mid-range users in this game will have a very poor visual experience due to how texture streaming is done. I'm honestly not sure how it was managed to have these textures with 8 GB of memory. Surely much better textures can fit in here. DirectStorage in this title is interesting, and I definitely liked how it helped out the mid-range CPUs here load faster, even if it's not the full Monty version with GPU decompression, as far as I understand it. That is the most successful aspect of this port, but in the end I'm saddened to see the game in the state it is in. On an ultra high-end PC with a fast CPU, fast GPU, and tons of video memory, the game is pretty smooth and it looks a lot cleaner than it does on console. But in the end, the amount of power and VRAM required to get there makes no sense to me. But that is enough from me for now. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support us on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. And other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Great start.